do want to keep that visible. All right. Let's go over here, and this is a speech I'd put together a while back about admittance to Azure land. When we're building our websites, I trust that everybody can hear me, feel free to ask questions. In fact, it'll be a lot more interesting if I do get questions, I'm sure. This is a speech I put together. I like to call it Managing Your Admittance to Azure Land. Okay. We'll be talking a little bit about, this is a set of things we'll talk about. We've got an introduction, review what the OSI network model is for those of you who don't remember it or maybe never have seen it. And then we've got a few different ways to manage access. A little bit about me, and I'll make the slides available. I'll get them sent out to you, to everybody. But a little bit about me. I'm currently working for Sageti as a consultant. I am actively on site building things in the cloud. I have my security certification, my CISSP, which is one of those big ones that is one of the ones I'm most proud of. I have my CCSK, which is the Certificate of Cloud Security Knowledge, which is put out by the Cloud Security Alliance. It's a nice step, especially if you're looking to get into cloud security. It's a great stepping stone. I have my Azure Solutions Architect. I'm active in actually 2 Toastmasters groups. And I'm currently the president or the chair of the local Association of Enterprise Architects chapter here in Minnesota. So as a way of introduction, I want us to think about the importance of good architecture. This is a gateway that I saw on the internet, and it says, think about it. Is this gateway going to be effective at keeping people out? Well, the bad guys have you built the bad guys an easy way to get in. One of the things we want to really do, and that's because I have very much of a security focus, is keep in mind not only how do we access Azure and my websites, but how do I secure it so that the people who are using it are active. Only the people who are supposed to be there get in. An important part of access to Azure or to any cloud network or to your on-premises network is thinking about the OSI networking model. Years and years ago, they came up with this nice little structure of a model. You start out with your physical structure, your data link structure. These are more of your physical things, the wire and what immediately goes across the wire. Then you have a network layer. Then you have the transport layer, and that's where your TCP lays. And you send your packets back and forth. And that's one of the points that we can introduce load balancing and access to the network. On top of that, you typically want to build additional layers that are your active control layers. And the layer 7 that we'll get into is a different layer for different style of managing access. Related to these models of how we transport things is DNS, which is the domain name system, and that's like the phone book that you go to, look up your name, your host name, and get back an IP address. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Let's start out with DNS routing. DNS routing is not truly a network layer. It's a way to handle connections and do that phone lookup. The key tool that Azure provides for us to use at the DNS layer, once you've got all of your DNS, you've got your sites registered, you use a TrafficMgr to set access to it. The next picture, I pulled that off of one of the Microsoft sites. This sort of demonstrates how you actually use, how the TrafficMgr serves up your request. I have a set of things that I've built probably in multiple regions that I put behind the TrafficMgr and let the TrafficMgr say, which phone number should I use for this client? So the user in their browser looks up and says, I want to use your application. And so they first look up the host name. And the host name and the TrafficMgr is going to go out, and before the DNS server returns an address, it's going to say, well, based on, you can set up criteria, and you can say things like, if you're use the region that's closest to the caller. Or maybe you do a round robin balancing, or you might even have international restrictions. If you're building a website in multiple countries, you might want to direct all of your European traffic to the European data center, your North American traffic to a North American data center, and traffic in Asia or the APAC nations to a different data center. Sometimes you need that for compliance reasons. Now we get to layer 4 routing. What is layer 4 routing? That's where we take an incoming packet without looking at anything beyond the address at the front end, and for the back end say, well, I'm going to send this packet to one of my back end servers. I can't look inside the packet. I can't look at anything besides the host name to decide where to route it. And then information from the back end saying which server is active. Let's do something like round robin, because I want to make sure I've set up a bunch of different servers. So I want to send half the traffic here and half the traffic there. Or maybe if I'm doing things like a blue-green deployment, I might want to direct 15% of the traffic to the new version and things like that. Azure introduces the Azure Load Balancer. They just called it a load balancer. It serves as a front end. Load balancers are most of the Azure services are located in a single region. So your Azure Load Balancer will typically send things to other sites in the same region. This shows a little picture of how the load balancer works. You come in, Your load balancer comes in with a public IP address, and then typically we'll send it to an appropriate backend. And you may have multiple VMs stood up or an app server set up. For example, if you're using the simple, or if you're using functions, those use app services behind it. If you've used the app service to deploy a website directly, and you said, I don't want to bother with a VM, well, this would be one of the ways you might want to route to, I've got multiple copies of it. Sometimes you need to get a little bit more complex. I have set up my back end in 2 regions, and I'm running them in an active configuration, and that means both regions are live. Or maybe I have active passive, and one region and the TrafficMgr profile is set up and it doesn't get a live signal from one of the regions. And so you don't necessarily use these tools exclusively. Sometimes you combine them. And this is an example of how you might want to combine it. Then we get into the more interesting layer 7 routers. In a layer 7 router, the router itself can actually see inside the packet, assuming that you put your SSL certificate on the router. The SSL connection goes to your router. The router decodes it, and then it can handle things like authentication. It's got full visibility to the path, and it may want to route. You may want to route the images to server A, or maybe a storage account. Your certain code to some servers, some other code to a different set of servers. You can set up a much more complex setting. You also have support for what I put the 3 letters WAF, which is a web application firewall. A WAF server is there to help protect you. Azure does this through the use of what they call an application gateway. I'm going to leave this up for a few seconds so that everybody can read it. I think it's always gets boring if the speaker reads the slide to you. But the cool thing is you can configure your application gateway to do some very complicated routing. And you can also enable firewalling so that it helps protect you. Here's a little bit more about what a web application firewall is. It can actually head off a lot of your common attacks so that you don't have to, while you always need to keep your server secure, you can let some of the security workload be handled at the front end rather than on your back end. This shows the OWASP top 10, and a WAF helps handle a lot of these common security attacks. And the OWASP, if you're not familiar with it, go out, learn about it. bring somebody in to talk about OWASP. These are some of the most common attacks. OWASP maintains a list of the most common attacks. And the sad thing is that a lot of the things are still on there. This is how you might configure your application gateway. It looks very similar to a load balancer, but in this instance, I'm sending my application to one server, and my image is off to my storage account to my blob storage, and I let that handle it. Now, one of the things I have to do is install my SSL certificates on my public certificates have to be installed on the application gateway. Now, one of the things you may want to consider, and this goes for, is adding internal certificates between your backend server and your application gateway so that they use mutual certificate authentication. And you're going to hear, I saw that you have a Zero Trust seminar coming up. This will help build towards that Zero Trust by using that mutual authentication and mutual certificates. Here's the more complicated setup where I have my where I use a TrafficMgr and multiple regions. Azure Front Door. Azure Front Door is kind of a cool product. It's a CDN, but it also, with some of the active capabilities, lets you sort of do this sort of thing automatically. Here's an example of your front door, how Front Door works. Now, one of the things with Front Door is it not only uses one major endpoint, but it actually tends to route traffic to many more local edge servers. So I can come into Front Door, and it'll actually cache. It can do things like caching, and is a nice way to support things to help support you. Let's talk about some third-party tools. There are dozens, if not hundreds of, there's probably a few dozen different third-party tools. Sometimes we don't necessarily want to use one of the ones that Azure is already using, or we may have other things we want to look at. Azure lets you set up NGINX. NGINX is not only a load balancer, it's a reverse proxy for API gateways. And I'm not touching much on API gateway, API managers, which is yet another another tool that's in our bag when you're building an API, specifically an API. But NGINX is kind of a nice little tool that you can set up. There's some nice you can go to the application store when you're setting up your Azure account and say, hey, I want to use NGINX. One cool and there are other servers like NGINX that you can also install as applications in your Azure network. You can have common rule sets. Sometimes you might want to, let's say I'm running multi-cloud and I want to have the same rule set apply in my Google Cloud or my AWS cloud. Well, NGINX might be the way to do it. I can set my rule sets up, and it can do things like it can also handle web application firewalling. And there's a whole bunch of other tools out there similar to NGINX that you can install as those third-party applications. A different kind of third party is an application such as Cloudflare. Cloudflare runs its own servers in the cloud. You connect to the Cloudflare server, it does some processing, and then passes it through to you. Cloudflare, in many cases, you might use Cloudflare instead of using a TrafficMgr. Cloudflare can do your layer 7 firewalling and routing. It's also got capability, it's also helpful with things like DDoS attacks. It's got some CDN capabilities. And at a previous company, we actually looked at, I can write my own little JavaScript pieces that help do special tasks for me. Like in our case, we wanted to have some of our clients needed to have their own mutual certificate, and we wanted to move the mutual authentication out there and then pass on to us what certificate came in. And so we needed to do a little bit of extra tweaking before it got to our servers. And of course, some of the most important considerations is we need, I see I have a question on Cloudflare. I don't have any specific articles. I've had some direct experience with it. What I'll try to do is maybe I can look up a few things and put some links, add some links to the documents.
Hey Tony, I'll take a look, see if I can find some Cloudflare stuff while we're talking here and post in the chat window.
That'd be great. But Cloudflare's got, you go out to their site, they've got a lot of nice things. What I'll talk about for Cloudflare, we had stuff, it would come to our Cloudflare account. We moved our HTTP certificate out there and let Cloudflare handle a lot of that web application firewalling and DDoS protection. We did a few extra pieces of work to handle things like mutual authentication, where we didn't want to register every single certificate that every client came in with at Cloudflare. We just let Cloudflare say, through some of the extra code that we could supply, we said, go make sure it's a valid certificate, and then add that certificate to what you send on to us. So those are a few of the things that you can do with Cloudflare. It's got some cool capabilities, and there's a whole bunch of other things similar to that. IMAUG, I think, has a similar type of product. And again, it's not a bad idea to always make sure that your traffic all along the path uses TLS or SSL to protect it. You have a presentation coming up in 2 weeks, I think, on maintaining zero trust. I highly recommend that. Sit in on that, learn more about it, because we can't trust we can't really trust in the good old days when I had my own when I had my data center. I would build out my outside firewall, my inside firewall, and if I'm inside the firewall, I'd say, oh, I can probably trust other people inside my company. But other things to do, a couple other things. Whitelist your client IPs, or maybe even your server IPs. So if I put a gateway in place, it's got its own a gateway or a load balancer. I may want to put that up. My back end may want to have that on its whitelist of IPs that it accepts, and it won't accept a connection from some random internet location. I want to limit who I trust to send data to my back. I want to make sure that everybody comes through that front door or through that gateway or load balancer. I don't want to let people come direct. Now, there are use cases where you might want to bypass that, but you want to make sure that you provide extra special protections for that. Maybe I have my QA people need to be able to get direct to some of my servers during initial testing of it during a deployment. But those are, or maybe you set your gateway up to be smart. If you're using an application gateway, you can actually set some of your endpoints to you can set up, well, let's see, maybe I'll use some sub host names for my test routes, or maybe part of the path will indicate that this is a test route and needs to go to this other server. So there are techniques that you can do to protect yourself and manage your gateways. So I'm going to stop at this point and say, are there any other any further questions? All right. So in review, we've talked about the Azure load balancers, which are layer 4. You use those. I would recommend mostly for a simple site. If you've got a simple site and you're not managing a lot of highly secure data on it, consider a load balancer. You might just want to use that to distribute your load. Let the back end, of course, the back end takes on more work. If you need to use for things like disaster recovery, you want to do something, you may want to do a multi-region, especially when you're doing active-active or international. Consider using your traffic manager in conjunction with a load balancer or an application gateway. But then again, you may want to even consider, depending on the website and what you're doing on it, front door. CDNs are a great way to accelerate access to your applications. Use an application gateway when you have a complex backend or multiple backends. And I highly recommend for either front door or the application gateway, enabling the web application firewall capabilities. We always want to make our sites as secure and safe as possible. And when might you want to look at third-party applications? There may be things like multi-cloud. Cloudflare might be great when you want to run your cloud on multiple. You want to run your application on multiple clouds. You have a use case where you don't want to tie yourself to just Azure. Maybe you want AWS, Google, Oracle Cloud. There's a bunch of those out there. OCI, Oracle's OCI. There's a whole bunch of other clouds out there, and so a third-party application might be a good way to help with that multi-cloud environment. Or maybe you are still in the process of helping your business or your client move from on-premises and into the cloud. Well, they may have already decided to protect themselves using NGINX or a similar product. Well, there's no reason you can't just move your NGINX servers from on-premises to the VMs that you've configured in your cloud. It's a great stepping stone for migrations. I think I see a question coming. Anybody have other questions? You want to jump in, and feel free to unmute yourself. Okay. I'm not real. Okay, I see the question says, is there a difference between web application firewall and V2, WAF V2? I'm typically, I would always say, especially with security, it's probably better to move to the newer one. I'm not sure what breaking, I'm not familiar enough with the differences between the two to give a real good judgment on what breaking changes are there. But if there aren't breaking changes, it's not a bad idea to move up. Other questions? I'll add, yeah, I would agree. V2, I'm sure, has a lot. Every new version does have lots of, so Robert, thank you for that comment. Yeah, V2, I'm sure, has many new features. And migrating upwards to newer versions when you can is generally a good thing. Now, sometimes there may be a few reasons why you don't want to migrate up. There can be cost concerns. But sometimes they change the pricing. They'll charge you, well, we're going to charge you more for the new version because we gave you more. So there are, anyway, again, questions, feel free to ask. In summary, there are many ways to secure your entry. You can use DNS routing. Sometimes that's the nice way to do it, because that's all you need. You're going to let your back end take care of most of the work, and you just need to shuffle code between multiple regions. Calls. But then you can consider adding multiple pieces. Add a layer 4 or a layer 7, an Azure load balancer or an Azure AppGtwy, or even to the mix, or use a CDN. Sometimes your application calls for that. Now, if you've got a lot of dynamic content like for an API, where you don't return the same data on hardly any call, or you've got a website that's highly dynamic and constantly changing, CDNs may not be as useful, or something that's customized. Internal tools versus external tools. And you've got Azure's native tools, which are pretty nice. You've got third-party tools that you can install in your cloud, whether it be things like NGINX can be installed either in your Azure or your AWS. You've also got third-party front-end servers like Cloudflare. I think Akamai is another one. Which should you use? It depends. Hopefully I've presented a few of the use cases that'll help identify when you might want to use one over the other. And its cost, again, it comes down to what's the cost versus the benefits of that approach. What kind of data are you using? If you're dealing with banking data or financial data or healthcare data, you may want to, you need to look at a more extensive security. Azure, okay, there's a question. Azure WAF versus Cloudflare. It depends, I think, a lot on if it's a pure Azure project. You may want you may get some benefits from using the AppGtwy with a WAF. Again, a lot of Cloudflare is, as I understand it, is much more broadly distributed, and so it may provide more endpoints for caching some of your CDN data, but it also provides similar WAF capabilities.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much a WAF versus Cloudflare. It's more of a Azure Front Door versus Cloudflare.
Yeah.
You really got that benefit of CDN. Front Door has SSL offloading. The point of presence where, as soon as you hit Front Door, you're basically on our backbone at that point and stuff. Where Cloudflare, you're still traversing over the public internet once you hit their system, but they've got the CDN capabilities and WAF capabilities like Front Door does. So it's kind of comparing those two products, what makes sense. I tend to see people to use Cloudflare if they already have a license with Cloudflare to use on their products. In other words, Front Door is definitely something a lot of people are taking a look at. Or
again, a multi-cloud environment.
Exactly.
Cloudflare would be great if I have multiple clouds. I might just want to pay once for that WAF capability, even if I've got some applications in Azure and some applications in a different cloud. The key is look at what's going to benefit you. Yes, Cloudflare does have WAF capabilities. In fact, that's one of the points they make on their website.
And I think the key is to use something that has WAF capabilities to it. I mean, if you're just taking up a site that's going to be globally accessed and high traffic, then always look at using a WAF. Whether it's AppGtwy, Cloudflare, Azure Front Door, put something in front of it. So.
Yes. The cost of implementing and maintaining the WAF capability on every single backend server can in itself justify using because you can install a WAF directly on your app servers, but the cost of maintaining that may not be worth it, and may very well justify the additional cost of an app gateway or with WAF or Front Door. And of course, Front Door is nice in that not only a traffic manager typically goes, I'm going to go to this endpoint in region A or region B. Front Door may have multiple endpoints in a given region and turn on the WAF capabilities. If you're building anything beyond a simple blog site, you probably want a WAF. Other thoughts or questions? Let's see if I got this thing. I'm going to see if I've got this. Okay. Here we go. I'm going to drop that. Oh. I will send the PowerPoint I will send this PowerPoint to the group admins, and I'll send it both as a PowerPoint and a PDF.
I'll go ahead and stop the recording.